All right, so this is part two of the lecture slides for chapter 5. Um, in this video, I'm going to walk you through evolutionary psychology and talk a little bit about how evolutionary perspectives have sort of shaped our view of classical and operant conditioning. And I want to come back to a topic we mentioned before, which is this idea of nature and nurture. And John Watson did something pretty profound in advocating for really the idea that human nature was shaped only by nurture. So nature or biology didn't really matter. And this goes back. This is didn't obviously start with John Watson, but this was an idea by John Locke, who argued that we are a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And it's inherent in ideas such as all people are created equal. And obviously, there's a lot to like in that perspective. I feel drawn to it, and it seems like it's egalitarian. But I think that psychology has sometimes been biased towards focusing only on nurture and sometimes ignoring nature. And I do think in the last, especially in the last 30 years, psychology has done a better job of appreciating nature, but still we're shaped by that history. Now, what some people don't know is that Darwin himself actually argued for some psychological theories, and he invoked associationistic explanations of learning when he talked about natural selection. So again, most of us are familiar with some of Darwin's ideas in regards to like physiological adaptation, how particularly the finches on I think it was the Galapagos Islands, depending on which island, the finches had stout and fat beaks to break nuts, or skinny, pointy beaks to eat out the insects. And so we're used to recognizing Darwin's role in sort of understanding those physiological adaptations. But he also touched on some behavioral adaptations, variations, and he argued that if a species can adapt their behavior, that can actually make them more competitive, that they can have an edge in survival and procreation. And if you think about that at an individual level, because he's obviously thinking at the level of the species, but if you think about just individuals who have behavior and physiology, that could potentially place them, if they have fitness in those behavioral and physiological differences, then that can actually this is pointing out that it could go both ways. Variations could put them at an advantage, and then variations could potentially put them at a disadvantage and perhaps produce fewer offspring. So behaviors whose consequences are most adaptive are most likely to survive. So in essence, Darwin, we could have talked about Darwin as a learning theorist, which is kind of interesting. So these ideas have influenced some psychologists and sociologists to think about the effect of nature on behavior. And so some psychologists have actually argued that we should fight against this idea that biology doesn't really matter. So this field of evolutionary psychology is what is doing that. They're trying to appreciate the role of biology and genetics as explanations for the way that humans and other animals learn and behave. And so if we return back to these examples we talked about in part 1, first off was taste aversion. Well, this obviously makes a lot of sense evolutionarily. So classical conditioning can sometimes occur very rapidly and selectively to a single sensory input, even after a long delay. And the argument is, well, this could be a biological adaptation. So we can have our typical classical conditioning adaptation, right? We become conditioned for most things with repeated exposures. But for taste, given that like there's a lot of poisons and unsafe food out there in the environment, uh, an individual who can identify poisonous tastes rapidly and learn those tastes on a basically on a one-time basis may be better suited to survive. And so the this might be just a special case of classical conditioning, but with these some sort of a unique process to it. And then we also, well, actually, two other examples, but ones that we haven't touched on yet, could show that biology is certainly at play in our learning processes. So the one example is auto-shaping. So auto-shaping is focusing on signals rather than rewards. My next slide will explain this better. And then the second idea is instinctive drift, reverting to instinctual behaviors even after you've trained. And what both of those are going to show you, and we'll get to them in a minute, it'll show you that instinctual behaviors can take over even when they are not reinforced, even when something else is reinforced and trained. Sometimes animals, and I would say humans as well, can go back to those instinctual biological behaviors. So essentially it's saying that there's biological constraints on learning, and that our capacity to learn, it can be shaped by our biology. Now this next slide is not all that intuitive, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually show you a video, and you should be able to see it here. It's a YouTube video. I'm going to press play, and there's no sound, so I'll talk over it. Okay, so you could see right here, there is a light that has come on. And with that light, there is a compartment here where the pigeon is going to find food. And this is just going to show it a few times. The light comes on, and then the compartment down here lights up, and the pigeon receives some food. Okay, so all of that is operant conditioning. There's a discriminative stimuli. Remember that from the last chapter, chapter 4. That tells them that if food is coming, and so peck. And then this is what auto-shaping is. You see that the pigeon is now pecking at that key. Okay, the pecking behavior was never reinforced. It was a spontaneous behavior. You can see a little closer there. Spontaneous behavior that this pigeon does. It's not reinforced. It's not, I'll switch back. It's not rewarded, and yet it does it automatically. So, and again, pecking at that key has no effect on whether or not it receives food. So, and in fact, if the pigeon didn't receive food, if they pecked at the key, they would still peck despite the fact this was no longer reinforced. So, if they had the pigeon peck after it's learned the basic stuff, if they didn't provide a food pellet when it pecked, it would still peck at that key. And again, classical conditioning would explain that they see the lighted key as a signal, right? It's a conditioned stimulus associated with the unconditioned stimulus of food, but it doesn't explain why it would peck at the key. It pecks because it associates the key with food, and so it's sort of a biological, instinctual behavior, and it just pecks at something that they associate with food. All right, another example of this is instinctive drift. This is perhaps a little bit more intuitive, and what they found is that some of Skinner's students were conditioning animals for like circus performances, and so they would do, like, pigs would be carrying little balls around and doing things like that. And what they found is that even after a lot of training, these animals that they, these are expert trainers, they would revert to some instinctual behaviors. Like they would uh, put the things that they're carrying. I think it was actually a token. They put a little token, a coin, into the mud and bury it with their nostril, their snout. And that was a behavior that is instinctual to a pig. And so the organisms revert to behavior that is biological, that has some sort of a evolutionary basis. So what they have found is not all behaviors can be conditioned and maintained by simply reinforcing regularly. There seems to be what we can call biological constraints, right? Have you ever tried to walk a cat? Our cat Halo is a Siamese, flame point Siamese, and we tried it a few times. And I remember when he was a kitten, he sort of went with it one time, and then we tried it a bunch of other times, and we had to just end up picking him up. Cats don't go for walks. It's rare, but dogs go for walks. And what's the difference? Well, it just seems to be something biologically different between dogs and cats. And certain types of learning are possible for certain animals, and others are pretty difficult. So um, uh, basically, these organisms are prepared for certain kinds of learning and certain kinds of behaviors, and then contra prepared for others, like walking on a leash. And when I think about that, I think about, okay, if you're a parent, um, sometimes it can be frustrating when a crying baby or a toddler is throwing a tantrum. And the the thing to know is that babies and toddlers will throw tantrums, will cry, no matter how well you train them, or what we would call parent them. So you could be the best parent, but a child's biology sometimes is going to take over, and they're going to engage in behavior that's just instinctual to them. So I hope those of you who are parents, again, take some reassurance in that just because your child is exhibiting bad behavior, doesn't mean that you've done something wrong and that you've encouraged it. Sometimes we have to just take into account that a child has poor emotion regulation. Their emotions get the better of them, and that's just something biological at that stage of life. And simply not permit it, right? Of course, you want to continue to parent the child and help them grow, but hopefully it gives you a sense of grace for yourself and saying, okay, just because they're doing some of these things doesn't mean I'm failing them. And so, and if we take that into adults, sometimes we have to recognize that certain adults have biological differences. And I want to say this cautiously and carefully, but some adults have biological differences that might lead them to behave in ways that might be difficult, that might make it difficult to do better behaviors. So when we think about that, and I'll sort of align this spiritually, but also just practically, we know that some people are biologically predisposed to alcoholism. We know that we could think about differences in the behavior of males, and the behavior of females. And we have to just account that, yes, socialization could be a part of that, but sometimes we have to just account for maybe there's biological differences that are also contributing to their behavior. And so some people are more likely to commit certain sins because of their biology. I'm not saying that one group of people might be more sinful than another. I think we're all sinful, and it doesn't matter. I don't think trying to measure and compare is very helpful and even practical, right? But I think I think that there's certainly differences in the patterns of our behavior, and of and of course this could mean that there could be genetic susceptibility to criminal behavior. We know that Antisocial behavior seems to be associated with a decreased response to punishment. So some people learn from punishment. Criminals are actually, strangely enough, the least likely to learn from punishment, at least those that have antisocial personality disorder, which not all do. But it's kind of interesting that we use punishment for a group of people that actually sometimes respond less well to punishment. Now, does this mean we overlook their behavior? Obviously not, but it causes us to really think about how should we respond. Now, I have this question up here. How do you reconcile that our biology can cause bad behavior with being created in the image of God? Well, I'm not sure about you, but in my understanding of faith, there's a place for the fall. Um, some people talk about the original sin of Adam and Eve, and when I think about that and the way that Genesis writes about that, it talks about how basically our biology is different as a result of the fall. And so what I would say is that yes, we are created in the image of God, but we've also inherited a sinful nature. That sinful nature somehow coexists with the image of God in us, and that leads us to be predisposed to certain behaviors. And again, there's variability in each person, but the predisposition is to sin, and that's common to us all. So for me, that's kind of how I wrestle with it. Kind of encourage you to think about your faith background, but certainly it's something that is an important question for those of us who are Christian and committed to our faith. All right, so that's the end of part 2. I'll end there, and our part 3, we'll talk about the brain. We'll unpack the role of the brain. We'll take a big picture look at it, kind of see if we can understand how that might factor into this process.